Well, welcome. My name's Trevor Bunch, Manager of Strategy, for those who don't know me. And it's great that we've got Rodney Tolley. I introduced Rodney Tolley yesterday at the university to a group of students as the world guru on walking, and I don't think anyone's challenging that title. It's great to see a good mix of people from a range of interests: council, development industry, real estate, and it's important to get this message out, I think. Deliberately titled the talk in a provocative way, Walking's Good for Business, and I think you'll be amazed at some of the stats that Rodney's able to present to you. I also want to introduce and thank Damien Tangey from the UDIA, who's also been responsible for promoting this event. And a reminder to people, I think I saw your email this morning, Damien. You sent another email out to members of the UDIA for the function we've got next Thursday, tomorrow week. So without further ado, I'll just ask Damien if you'd like to say a few words as well, sort of co-host of this event, and then I'll introduce Rodney formally to you.
I'd just like to say thank you to Council for involving industry in these discussions. You know, the UDIA has had some discussion with Council over recent months about what is an appropriate engagement strategy for the residential strategy discussion, and involving us in discussions like this, having access to wonderful speakers like Rodney, is a fantastic opportunity, and we really appreciate that, Trevor. The conversation that industry has been able to have with Council over the last few years has grown to be more comprehensive, more detailed, and more rewarding for both parties, I think. If we start to look at this sort of initiative, I think Rodney might have had some involvement in the Walkable Bendigo project a number of years ago, or some knowledge of that, and changing people's habits and patterns and changing what we do in delivering products for people to live in and communities for them to participate in takes time. So it takes 10 or 15 years. Any project I plan now is on the ground in 4 or 5 years' time. So we really need to start thinking carefully about how we plan in that medium to long term. This doesn't apply to an inter-urban Bendigo and an inter-urban market that is part of our future. It applies to that and existing suburbs that we're creating on the fringe. So if I look at what we're doing in business now and say that we don't pursue a minimum standard process, that we'll look at our developments, we'll look at our competitors and industry where we say we need to provide more opportunity for people, walking, health, fitness, cycling, access to safe nodes of walking and cycling off-road is a key. So we're starting to provide more than minimum standard in our estates and our deliveries. I think that we really need to concentrate on how that works over time, and I think that the investment by industry in those key elements will lead to far better environments for people, better connectivities, and I think that leads into development contributions plan discussions about new neighbourhoods and new areas where Council needs to take the initiative on linking up existing path networks and existing communities to new communities and those sorts of elements in participation with industry. So there is a result there we can achieve. We're working in the right direction, and I congratulate Council on their initiative on having us here today. Thank you.
Rodney has been on an interesting journey himself. He started out as a geography teacher and worked his way through a university, and he says he first of all discovered transport, then he discovered active transport, cycling, and now into pedestrian and walking. Rodney is an interesting example of a person who's taken a passion and made it sort of almost a life's journey. The last 10 years, Rodney spends about 10 weeks a year in Australia. Interestingly, he says that the people who are engaging him most now are people, health professionals, who can see the turnaround that's needed in terms of the way people respond to their environment. And he, of course, is well known for being a director of Walk 21, which I think is one of the founders of Walk 21, which has now become the benchmark flagship conference in the world, which, by the way, will be held in Sydney in October later this year. So without further ado, hand over to Rodney, and there will be an opportunity for some questions.
Okay, thanks very much for that warm introduction, Trevor. I'll issue you with a mild admonishment, if I may. I talk about walkers. I don't talk about pedestrians.
Right.
And the reason is, an ex-academic, I don't mind anybody calling my work wrong, but don't call it pedestrian. It's the worst insult you can imagine. So I try not to use the word pedestrian. It always seems to me to be really quite a negative phrase. It's sort of defining a human being without a vehicle. And I'd rather think of humans on their feet, which as a more positive kind of phrase. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak this morning. I hope you've had enough to eat and I can keep your hunger at bay for 30 minutes or so. And then I believe we'll take some questions and so on afterwards. Okay, so what I want to do is to talk about the title that's up here and try to sort of plug in the work that I do, which is, Trevor says, is partly about Walk 21, which is this not-for-profit organisation based in the UK but operating worldwide, which tries to support professionals wherever they are in developing more walkable communities. But also partly, as Trevor said, working with councils and local governments and health authorities, mostly in Australia, but I now live in the United States, so that's happening in North America as well. So that's the sort of two parts of what I do. So the object this morning was really to come to speak to you to sort of try and get us to discuss how we connect these walking issues, which is my area, and the development issues, which is very much your area rather than mine. And we'll see if there's any kind of nexus between the two. Try turning it on, that usually helps. Okay, so what I want to talk about is these kinds of issues. Just make sure we're all on the same page about benefits and barriers to walking. Have a look at what the major case for walking is in those three particular areas, and then look at what we might need to do to make walkable places to finish with. So let's look first of all at some benefits of walking, and I'm going to be very quick on this because I think everybody in the room knows these. It's just that sometimes we really don't put them together, it seems to me, to make the really powerful case that we should do. Number one, everybody walks. I'm a cyclist myself, so I'm not going to say anything against cycling, which is a great form of active transport, but let's remember that cycling is always a minority activity and walking is not. If you include wheelchairs, scooters, mobility devices, skateboards, rollerblades and so on, everybody walks. And so when you're standing in front of council and asking for resources to support what you're doing, this is not a special interest group. This is actually asking for money for the entire community. So that's an important starting point. It encourages community cohesion because we know the communities that work are ones where neighbours can talk to each other, where people can meet on the street, where they can make face-to-face contact and meet real people rather than shouting through the windows of cars. That doesn't work to stick communities together. And we've got 50 years of evidence to show that people who live on busy streets have less friends, less acquaintances, go out less often, and are more subject long-term to mental illness. So community cohesion is a critical issue, and walking brings that. If you develop a neighbourhood where people can be together. Thirdly, we all know that it increases personal security. The scary streets are the empty ones. The safe streets are the ones that are full of people. People in public are your friends. You're not going to get mugged in a busy street. There's if you like, a critical mass. Once you get large numbers of people walking, it becomes safe, so more people themselves walk. So there's a personal security issue. There's an issue for children as well. All our surveys from around the world will show that our kids want to walk more, they want to be more active, they want to be outside more, and we stop them as parents because of our twin fears of traffic danger, which is real, and stranger danger, which is a myth. But we react to the myth, withdraw our children from public space, drive them everywhere in cars, and as a consequence, take away from them the normal, daily, routine, active movement which they want to have. And particularly here we're talking about walking and cycling to school. So that's a major international problem where kids aren't doing what they want to do because of our fears, rational or otherwise. Fifthly, there's an issue of public transport. Not maybe a key problem for you in Bendigo at the moment, but who knows into the future. We've got to remember that your public transport, however good it is, will not work if the walking to the public transport and from it is unsatisfactory. Very clear evidence from lots of research studies that show that the number of people riding a bus or a light rail or a train depends very clearly on the quality of the walk to the station or stop and the quality of the walk from the station or stop at the end. So if you don't get that right, then your public transport, however much you invest in it, will not be successful. And then lastly here, perhaps counterintuitively, more walking brings more road safety for everybody, because if you have an environment with lots of people on their feet, the end result is that traffic is slower. The traffic environment, if you like, is more benign. Drivers are looking out for people. They're slowing down because of other people using the road space. And the end result is less crashes, less fatalities, and a much safer environment, not just for the walkers, but for people driving cars as well. And a very, very clear, demonstrable link between the amount of walking and road safety. So there you are. I think we probably know all of those 6, and there are many more benefits besides. But those, I think, make a fairly coherent case for us having more walking in our environments. Well, if it's that great, surely we must have made it really, really easy in places around the world. The problem is, wherever I go, it seems to me that somebody's got there first. They've been writing a best-selling sort of manual, engineering or planning manual, whatever. I've never seen it, but I would guess it's called something like Planning Cities as if People Don't Matter. It's got a lot of chapters. I'll just give you 2 or 3. Chapter 1 is always stop them walking, and there are lots and lots of ways that we manage to do this by, not clearing up after ourselves, by letting people park suburban assault vehicles on city pavements, by just stupid engineering. We've been pretty good at this all around the world, quite remarkable. And I saw a wonderful example recently in New Zealand. A brand new supermarket in a wet town with lots and lots of car access. Couldn't see any access for people on foot at all, but walkers are very resourceful people. I knew that somehow they'd get access to it. So I looked around, back of the car park, I found it, here it is. It's a goat track, up through the bushes, at the top of the goat track. They'd smashed their way through the chicken wire fencing to get their groceries home. And it gets better. This is a wet town. It's really, really steep up here, so somebody's thoughtfully tied a rope to a telegraph pole, and you can now sort of abseil up to home with your groceries and get a bit of physical activity as a result of going shopping. I mean, how hard do we have to make this, for goodness sake? Chapter 2 is always make crossing the road really, really difficult. Shot in Melbourne here. 600 metres between crossing opportunities. If you're seriously asking people to walk 15 minutes, sorry, not that long, 10 minutes to a cross, push the button, wait for permission to cross, 2 minutes to get across, another 10 minutes to walk back, or sprint across 10 metres of bitumen in the face of instant death, you know what people will do. If you plan an environment like that, people will behave as effort-minimising human beings, and they will run. So you get this kind of scene where people are crossing, or rather running mid-block, despite all the signs in the world. Chapter 3 is chapter 5. Well, I'm missing some chapters out. Make sure it's really scary. I'm not sure which station this is. I can't read that one. Is it Kensington Station? I think it probably is, actually, in North Melbourne, where you invite your pedestrians on their way to the station to go down the kind of black hole of Kensington here. I mean, who the hell would want to do that in the day, let alone at night? Chapter 6, poor quality maintenance, vehicle overriding, smashing the footpath. Most of the hospital admissions for elderly people in the UK as a result of road environment issues are a result of falls, not crashes. Falls is a key issue. 20% of all elderly person admissions in Brazil, I was told last week, are a result of people falling. And in fact, a planner in Sao Paulo told me that people there walk around with a rosary in their hand because they're likely to fall into a hole and go straight to hell. I don't think it's quite as bad in Bendigo, but it's a universal problem. And this one maybe does concern some of us in this room because this is a critical chapter. Put things so far away, excuse me, that nobody can walk to anything. And this is the kind of stuff that we've been doing for years. It may be a comfortable living environment inside those properties, but outside there isn't anything else. There's a footpath being thoughtfully provided here on both sides of the road and some Mickey Mouse traffic calming as well. But the problem is there's nobody here because there's nothing to walk to. There's no school, there's no shops, there's no facilities, there's no work, there's nothing. And as a result, there isn't anybody in the public environment at all. And there won't be in the future. And these are now being referred to as obesogenic environments. because we know that people who live here will not walk, and if they don't walk, they are much more likely to be overweight, much more likely to be obese, and as a consequence, much more likely to die younger. So extraordinarily, we've actually been embarking on this venture for years of creating environments that will make people sick, rather than creating environments which will make people healthy. So my passion, if you like, is making sure we don't make these mistakes again, and we create places which build walkability, active living into where people live. Okay, well, I've touched on health issues there. Let me just build that case just a little bit more about health, the demographic case and the economic case for walking. The health case, first of all, again, this is pretty obvious stuff, I think. If we look at developed countries, through the last 200 years and look at the urban health penalties that those countries have experienced. Obviously, we went through a period of infectious diseases, and through good quality planning and other things, better water, etc., we diminished that. We went through a crisis in urban air pollution, and we diminished that. We went through a crisis in road trauma, and we've diminished that. But the two upward inflections in the graph are the ones that are now most worrying: greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, and the dramatically rising line of obesity. And these two are utterly unsustainable trajectories, and they clearly lie within our gift to do something about them. And indeed, we have to do something about them in the way that we dealt with these other urban penalties in the past. And the connection to what we in this room do, I think, is pretty straightforward. We maybe conceptualize development in our own minds. We think about the kinds of planning and investment that we might put on the ground. That may result in a certain kind of development pattern. That development pattern itself then leads to various transport choices, and those transport choices then themselves lead to the size of our waistlines. And that is a fairly clear connection between those four stages of our urban planning. And my concern is the outcomes here are a catastrophe for Australia. And 57% of Australians don't get sufficient activity for a health benefit. Now, you might be saying, well, why don't they go to the gym? Well, every January, just look at the gym membership figures in the first 2 months of the year. They shoot up on January the 1st and they shoot back down on February the 1st because we're too busy to do that kind of stuff. Whereas walking as part of your normal daily activities, 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes at lunchtime, 10 minutes in the evening, you've got your 30 minutes cardiovascular activity protection right there as part of your ordinary everyday. And so instead, we're dealing with the end-of-pipe stuff here. We're dealing with the consequences of inactivity by building new hospitals, I mean, Bendigo here, to simply cope with the disease burden that's rising so very sharply. Now, I haven't got the slide here for Australia, but I've seen the data, and it's very similar. This is actually for British Columbia. It's used by a planner called Penny Ballum, and she calls it her clanger slide, because this is the one that makes everybody sit up and take notice when they're thinking about resourcing. This is expenditure on three issues projected into the future in British Columbia. On the assumption that everybody wants their kids to be educated, she's held the education expenditure in British Columbia level, at its current level. 27% of all expenditure goes on education. But she's continued the line of rising health costs into the point in 2018 when that figure plus education equals the total budget, which means that by 2018 in British Columbia, there won't be anything left for anything else. All expenditure in that province will go on those two issues. And I haven't got the figures for Australia in front of me, I'm sorry about that, but I've seen them, and that figure is pretty similar. The date may not be 2018, it may be 10 years beyond that, but there is, without question, coming an intersection between these lines, which will mean that there won't be any money for almost anything that Bendigo City Council does. There won't be any state money for anything else but dealing with the health consequences of our activities. And you can see very clearly where health sits in that. Okay, that's all rather gloomy, but let's see how we might actually deal with that in a more positive way. There's a demographic case for more walking as well. I'm at the sort of leading edge of the boomers, the cusp of the boomers. who are coming at you now. We've been described as the silver tsunami of boomers that are coming over the horizon. This is this lump in the population from the post-war period that's moved through its middle ages and is now entering seniorhood. And as the boomers become seniors, they will change their behaviour. They will stop running and stop playing tennis, and they'll walk, because that's what seniors do. So they will be demanding walkable environments. They'll also need walkable environments because they'll be driving less. They'll become more disabled, less confident, and they'll be giving up their driving licenses and leaving their car keys on one side. And so what they will require is a walkable, livable environment into the future. And that's, a responsibility of us to provide that for them. And bear in mind what the societal costs will be if we don't do that, because if they can't walk and they stay in their houses, the costs of healthcare rocket very, very fast. So we need for those boomers to be able to connect with their neighbours, to get to the pharmacy, to get to the doctors, to get to other people and recreation facilities and so on. Otherwise, the health costs and the community costs will be very, very expensive. What we actually want to do is to look at what these sort of geriatric curves look like, and put yourself in these positions. This is your functional capacity, your ability to do things, get around, hear, see, and so on. And it, of course, with age, it declines. And the blue line here this is a non-walking smoker whose functional capacity will decline quite quickly with age until finally they disappear off this planet. The problem is that because they're non-walking smokers, they will experience this period which we might call deficient survival, where they're alive, but it ain't much fun. Because everything is becoming so much more difficult, and they're very expensive for us to look after as well. Ideally, what we want is walking non-smokers who will maintain pretty good functional capacity until the day before the Grim Reaper calls, and then they'll just fall off the edge. So that's ideal, and it's very inexpensive for society to do it like that. And I think Aldous Huxley put it beautifully when he said, the goal is to die young but as late as possible. So what we are needing to do is to provide the facilities for people to be able to do that. Okay, a second demographic case concerns a completely different generation, and this one might surprise you a little bit more. And this is the different behaviour of Gen Ys around the world. Now, you may not see this yet in Bendigo, but I'm darn sure you will, if not immediately, then very soon. In the US, for example, Gen Ys, that's the cohort from about 20 to 35 years of age, their driving mileage has fallen by a quarter in a decade. A typical 58-year-old American now drives 11,500 miles, and a typical 28-year-old drives only 7,000 miles. Their licence holding is falling very sharply as well. They're postponing getting driving licences until later, and in many cases not getting them at all. And that's true also here in the major cities in Australia. If you look at public transport usage in Western Australia, for example, the Gen Y cohort is using public transport much more than their numbers would suggest. And if you talk to Gen Ys in big cities around the world, what they're doing is triangulating between three forms of transport. Public transport for the longer journeys to get to work and so on, walking and cycling for around the neighbourhood, and if on the rare occasions when they need a car hire. And the last thing they were interested in doing is buying, owning and parking a car. It's a nuisance. It doesn't benefit their lifestyles at all. And so Gen Ys are moving in huge numbers to the inner areas of large cities where they can live this kind of lifestyle. And I came across a really interesting stat very recently. 2/3 of American college-educated kids now, first of all, choose where to live, and secondly, get a job. Now, that's a very interesting twist on the way most of us have done that in the past. Most of us went through university and got a job. And even if it was somewhere where we didn't want to be, we didn't mind because we'd got a job. But these creative individuals are saying, well, yeah, Baltimore, yeah, maybe. Boston, maybe. Melbourne, Bendigo, no. And they go there and then they get a job. Because what they're really looking for is an environment in which they can live the kind of way that they want to. And that is car-free or car-light, close to coffee, close to friends, close to culture, close to the things that are important to them, and not out in the burbs where my generation grew up. And if you ask yourself why, the honest answer is I don't know, but I suspect there are a number of reasons behind this. But I picked this one up recently. I thought this was fun. This is General Motors in the States last year advertising a new car. And they say, good, there's an alternative to the bus, and on the front of the bus they've photoshopped destination creeps and weirdos. And what they're trying to do here is to sell the idea of the bus as a kind of loser cruiser that nobody would ever want to use, because Gen Ys, millennials, are not buying cars in the same number as previous generations did. And you can ask yourself why. Well, it could be insurance and licenses. It could be living at home longer. Certainly living more in the inner city is part of that. Cultural factors. The car isn't a status symbol for Gen Ys in anything like the way it was for previous generations. Environmental concerns. But I suspect, I have no evidence, I suspect it's really a clutch of issues surrounding technology. Being savvy about using public transport apps, for example, is part of that. Makes using public transport so much easier for them. Facebook and other social media ways of staying in touch. And I suspect, most of all, it's texting. I now live in the US, and it's the public campaign about driving and texting is extraordinarily powerful. It's one of the major causes of road trauma for people in their 20s, driving and texting. And so the messages are very similar as the ones to a previous generation about drinking and driving. You know, you shouldn't do both at the same time. And the texting and driving message is the same. But it seems to me the implication is, well, if you're not going to do both, you should give up texting. Well, what Gen Ys seem to be saying is actually we'll give up driving, because texting is more important to us than driving. And so, I mean, that's a guess. I really don't know. But the end result is a very, very strong shift of Gen Ys towards active travel, feet, public transport, and bicycles. Okay, thirdly, I promised you some stuff on the economic case for walking, and I'll quickly put this out in front of you here. I was lucky enough to be asked by the Heart Foundation of Australia 2 years ago to look at evidence around the world to try and answer this question. Does a walking and cycling friendly main street provide retail and economic benefits? And the resulting publication was called Good for Business. It's available on the Heart Foundation website. It's just a small pamphlet. Not original research, it just summarizes evidence from around the world. And the conclusions from that, I'll just set these out in front of you. One thing that was very clear is that we don't have enough data, but whenever we do get data, it's very clear that walking expenditure is much more important than we thought it was. So whenever we do those numbers, we find that people on foot spend much more than we imagined. And the reason is that they may not spend so much as car drivers per visit, but they visit much more often. And the end result at the end of a week or a month or whatever it is that they've accumulated far more expenditure. So if there's more walking in a town, the evidence from around the world is that these kinds of things will happen. Rents, prices will rise, the local economy and business will benefit from that. And the conclusion is fairly clear that space for people is actually much more important in our retail areas than is using that space for car parking. And so the argument, the perpetual argument that we hear that car parking outside every shop is critical for that shop's business, frankly, is just simply not supported by the evidence. I couldn't find any evidence to support that assertion at all. And what I did find was lots of places that are removing those car parking spaces and giving the space back to people in the form of wider pavements, etc., and reaping the huge benefits that come from that. So the evidence is that local businesses benefit most from reducing traffic speeds, widening footpaths, and making the street more attractive for people to spend time and money. So to summarize, what we're saying is that walking is actually a precondition in modern cities for a good economic environment. And I've never been able to prove this last statement, but I'm pretty sure it's true, which is that the slower we travel, the more we spend. And what we need to be doing in cities is to put as much friction in the street as possible to slow everybody down so that they have a chance to stop, turn around, stand, window shop, chat, meet people, sit down, have a coffee, recover their resources, and then get up and go and spend some more money. And that way you can shake the money out of their trouser pockets and their handbags a lot easier than if you speed them through. So slowing them down becomes a critical element. Okay, well, if that's true for shops and expenditure, does it work also in terms of property values and other ways that we might measure economic benefit? Well, Todd Littman's been working on this in Canada for a number of years, and he's come up with lots of evidence to show that people who live near shared paths, for example, will benefit from higher property prices normally. New urbanist houses do better in terms of value than others, and so on. You can see the evidence there for yourself. But what I think is really persuasive is new evidence that's arriving as a result of this simple computer algorithm called walk score. Now, I don't know how many people in the room know about walk score, but it's available here in Australia. And what it does is measure the walkability of an address. So tonight, when you get home, jump on the web and put your own home address into walkscore.com, and it will give you a number. It's the walkability of your house. And the number will be somewhere between 0, which is a disaster because you can't walk anywhere, and 100, which is paradise. And somewhere on that scale will be your house. And this photograph was taken in downtown San Francisco about 3 years ago now, and a realtor here is selling this property not on the basis that it's got a nice view or good parking or whatever, but on the basis that it scores a perfect 100 on walkscore.com. Wow. That's a completely out of left field idea. Walkability sells. And so people have now been doing the numbers, and the numbers are actually quite impressive. In the US, for every extra point of walkability on your house, its value will on average be somewhere between $700 and $3,000 more. And WalkScore is now being hit 10 million times a day around the world. There's a WalkScore professional version which is being used by 30,000 realtors as a way of selling property. So this is a remarkable shift just in 4 or 5 years, that walkability is rising to the forefront of ways in which we would sell houses. Okay, now bringing that really up to date, there's some work from Chris Lineberger, who's a developer in the US, and Alfonso. They're sort of dividing walkability of a neighborhood into sort of 5 categories. And they're saying that for each category, if you can lift your neighborhood from, say, poor walkability to average walkability, then these numbers will happen. Rents will go up by that much of offices, retail rents go up by this much, retail revenues by this much, residential rents for sale, residential value will go up by this amount. So this is a huge study across Washington, I believe it is, showing very clearly that as you push a neighborhood up the walkability scale, the economic consequences are really large and measurable. So we move beyond intuition now. We're into an area where we know for sure walkability brings greater property value. Okay, well, what does that mean in terms of our work? It means that we have to attend to the things that make places walkable. And I hesitate to put density at the top of this list because I know it's a kind of, one of those words for a lot of Australians. You mustn't talk about density, but it's just part of the picture. If you want a place to be walkable, it has to be diverse. It has to, in other words, have things that people can walk to. It has to have good design in the sense that blocks must be short. There should be permeability. You should be able to walk through intersections very, very easily. The destinations have to be accessible, so it has to be close to where there is work and shops and schools and so on. And the distance to transit needs to be minimized. And density also, to provide the sheer number of people that services will need, is part of the picture. But don't let us run away with the idea that it's all about densification. It isn't. It's about a combination of things that will support higher density developments as well. So what I'd like to bring to you is just one example of a town that's done this. Now, Portland in the US is bigger than Bendigo, but it's not that much bigger than Bendigo intends to be in 20 or 30 years' time. And Portland's very interesting because it's been doing this sort of stuff for, 30, 40 years now. It has an excellent public transport system. Its neighborhoods are much more walkable and cyclable than most cities in the US. Result, the average person living in Portland drives 20% less than other metropolitan areas in the United States. So if they drive 20% less, they save a lot of money. So what do they spend the money on? Well, if they were driving, it would go into the pockets of car companies and fuel companies, all of whom would export the money to somewhere else in the world, or certainly not spend it in Portland. But these people have got the money in their pockets now because they're not driving. So what do they spend it on? Well, Portland's got more independent bookstores than almost any other US city. It's got great coffee. It's got more restaurants per capita than anywhere else. So in other words, the money that people save from living in a walkable place goes into the local economy, not exported to somewhere else. And let's twist this another way. The average American has to work from January the 1st to April the 13th to pay for their car. 14 weeks a year is wasted. You're just earning money to pay for the car that you've got. In Portland, you only have to work to March the 23rd to pay for your car. So you can then have 3 weeks fun. Just take off, go somewhere. You don't have to work for 3 more weeks because you live in a place that's walkable. And I think that's really quite an interesting twist on what this means. But the economic impact is really profound. The number of college-educated Gen Ys is increasing 5 times faster than in the US as a whole. And a comment again from Lineberger that metropolitan areas that don't offer walkable opportunities won't get these people. They won't get creative Gen Ys who want to come and live in a place like this. Okay, so a couple of key principles just before I finish. There are many, but I do think these are really at the heart of what we need to be talking about. We have to move away from these loop and lollipop, disconnected, circuitous kinds of street layout, where we can draw hypothetical lines on here. 400 meters, that's a 5-minute walk, or a 10-minute walk. We can draw lines on there, but they're almost meaningless because only about a third of the places inside the theoretical 5-minute walk are actually 5 minutes walk, because the street system is so disconnected. But if you were to provide something that's much more connected, much more permeable, then you can get that figure up to about 60% of the people inside the theoretical 5-minute walk limit are actually within 5 minutes walk of things. So a key principle here is going to be the layout that fundamentally makes a place walkable from the start. And a second one is the 5 Cs, if you like. We all like the 3 Ds, the 4 Es, or the 5 whatevers, but the 5 Cs have often been used to describe really good quality walking environments. And this is, I think it's Ann Street in Brisbane. It's everything that those places I showed at the start of the talk are not. It's comfortable, it's convenient, it's convivial, it's connected, it's conspicuous. It's got a good level surface here. It's got active frontages. It's got public transport. It's got a bus stop. It's got facilities like a phone booth. It's got seating. It's got people walking for shopping, people walking for business, people chatting. It's got almost everything that a street needs to make it a congenial, pleasant place to be. So it's not difficult. It just means thinking through those issues. Now, in terms to guide us, we've had the PIA document around for a number of years now, Healthy Spaces and Places, with its 10 design principles. That's been followed in many communities to guide the kinds of developments that we're bringing into the future. But I wanted to bring you this because this is absolutely hot off the press. I was at the launch of this last Wednesday, a week ago, in Western Australia. This is a new approach that's being sponsored, as you can see, by the Heart Foundation. But what is really interesting here is that the Heart Foundation have led it, but it is a collaboration between the Department of Health and the Department of Transport and the UDIA and many, many stakeholders across Western Australia to bring a new design guide out there for people to use in a very practical kind of way. It's called, as you can see, Healthy Active by Design. I'm sorry, I haven't got the web address here, but just stick that in and you'll get it straight away. It's a web-based resource. And what it does is focus on key issues of any new development. So if you're considering any residential subdivision or a brownfield site or whatever, you need to be thinking about these issues. But the problem is these historically have meant different things to different people. And so what they've done with the tool, which as I say is entirely web-based, is provide for every one of these. Let's go back and let's say you're not really sure what sense of place means. You know, how would I create a sense of place in my new development? Well, go to the website, hit the sense of place button, and what will come up will be a series of layers. And at the really basic level will be the evidence base. What is the evidence around the world that sense of place brings good quality livability to the neighbourhood that you're building? And the evidence base is really, really strong. Billy Giles Cortai from the University of Western Australia has been at the heart of this. Powerful medical evidence bases for all of these things. Then links and priorities, best practice case studies, examples from around the world, a checklist of things that you should or you shouldn't do, and some program and resource links. And those things are available in layers for every single one of those 10 design features which you would be considering as part of your new development. So I commend that to you very strongly. It'll be Western Australian case studies, but there's no reason at all why that wouldn't still be of great value to you. So what I think is emerging here is that walkability lies absolutely at the heart of almost anything that anybody in the room from council is trying to do. You're trying, obviously, to keep costs down, to bring economic vitality to the city, to improve security and safety, to have democratic engagement and environmental sustainability. All of those things are critically important to the operation of a city. And for those of you in the room involved in new developments and whether residential or otherwise, many of those things will be important to you as well. So walking and walkability really lies so much at the heart of almost everything that we're trying to achieve. And so I'll finish by simply asking you a question. You know, what kind of Bendigo, Australia place do you want to live in the future? These are both Australian case studies. You know, I freely admit that they're a biased selection, but you know, you can have this place up here if you want, or you can have the one on the bottom right. And you know, it wouldn't surprise you to know that I prefer the one on the bottom right. The one on the top, they've both got people in. There's lots of people in both of those pictures. The problem is the one on the left, they're all in cans. And I don't like canned things very much. Down here, they're all fresh. And I much prefer fresh people to canned people. But more seriously, the one on the bottom right here has got walkers in. And that's critical for me because I argue very strongly that walkers are the indicator species for quality of life in our cities. Okay, thank you very much.
It is a key destination in Victoria. We have relevance. We need to maintain that relevance. So if I look at your health comment, I agree entirely, and the UDIA responded very heavily to a fat suburbs article in The Age about 2 years ago and spoke about the good work that it's doing now and into the future in subdivision and walkable communities. Admittedly, the lessons of the past are those. Yep. We do need to look to the future. And if we look at the way the council has structured the development of the residential strategy, it's been done in tandem with the integrated land use transport strategy, the ITLIS strategy, and I've been involved in those discussions, and they revolve a lot around what you've been saying. So it's okay for me to plan a subdivision and put all the right connections in. I need to connect to the existing neighbourhood, but I also need public transport facilities to other destinations. So we really need to work hard on that overall concept for Bendigo to maintain our relevance as that key lifestyle living destination. So I think council's on the right path there. It's a matter of continuing that community engagement and discussion, providing the facilities and enabling the use to create the cultural change, I think, that we're looking for. So if I then go to the demographic section of your discussion and look at that, I was confused by one part. I'm middle-aged and I think I have a young mind, so I'm not sure which gen I am. but if I look at demographics of Bendigo, the Bendigo of the past isn't the Bendigo of the future. We produce more than the state average of 3 and 4 bedroom housing. We have a greater diversity of smaller households than the state average. We have a gap in our housing market now that is growing. And I'll unashamedly plug our function next Thursday with Trevor and Andrew speaking, Gary Pendlebury and myself. And it's about not the residential strategy, which isn't yet released, it's about the information that's led to informing the strategy. So I urge you to come along and have a discussion and think about that before you look at a strategy and say, I agree or I disagree or I like this or I don't like that. Before you make those judgments, have a look at the work, the research, the demographic changes and the anticipation that's gone into creating a document for the future, because there is change. It's the new golden era of Bendigo, our lifestyle, our diversity, the cultural growth of Bendigo. We are on the cusp of achieving wonderful results here for this community for the long term, and these plans are instrumental in that. And if I go to the last point on business, and I'll bring it into in or out of Bendigo and say that there's not many places in the country, in fact I don't think there's another place in the country where you've got what is a sub-regional shopping centre by floor space area in a traditional CBD grid, and then you've got a marketplace development which is another sub-regional shopping centre of modern convenience located basically right next door to each other. And the expectation has been of the past that I can drive into Bendigo, and the convenience of the CBD grid is I can park in front of the shop I want to visit, go and do my business and go again. We need to change the culture. We need to get that walkable environment working. We need to reinvigorate that CBD grid. I'm a great supporter of the CBD. I don't like the shopping centres myself. I like to park and walk and do a lot of business around town, and I think those lessons on how we do that and reinvigorate that business community and re-engage those young people. So I take the point they do shop on the internet, but I also take the point that if there's a sense of place and a sense of ownership and a sense of contribution, and that is the cafe culture and those other things that you can link into that process, that you can engage them to say, yes, I do want to spend my money here and maintain and grow this environment. So they're probably the three observations I make on your discussion, and I thank you very kindly for coming along today, and thanks to Council for organising. Thank you.
Thanks very much.